Hello, and welcome to Since Attlee Churchill, the podcast about British political history since the Second World War. I'm Lee Evans, a historian of the Conservative Party.
And I'm Richard Johnson, a historian of the Labour Party, and Lee's husband. In each episode, we'll be chewing over delightful morsels of British political history.
This week, we're looking at a topic a little bit more contemporary than usual, and in fact, we're turning the tables on the usual format of the podcast. We're going to be talking about an aspect of Conservative Party history that Richard has researched, in particular, how Theresa May became arguably Britain's most pro-LGBT, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender Prime Minister of them all. It's a surprising story in at least two regards. One is that it is May who has this title. She's the daughter of an Anglican vicar, and in some ways is seen as embodying suburban, rural, home counties values in British politics. And I mean none of that as a criticism of her at all. And the second reason why it's arguably surprising is that she is of course, Conservative Prime Minister. And it's not necessarily the Conservative Party with which you would associate actually quite radically progressive views on some of these topics. And so I think May's journey, especially during her time as a Member of Parliament from 1997 up to the point that she resigns as Prime Minister in 2019, is a particularly interesting one and worthy of a case study. First, Richard, I think we should put this all into a little bit of context about the recent history of the Conservative Party, and we'll use these terms somewhat interchangeably, but gay rights / LGBT rights. As we go through the podcast, we'll distinguish the LGB aspect from the T aspect, because of course they take on a very different political dynamic and still do in politics today. But in this earlier stage, I think we're much more often, of course, almost exclusively, in fact, talking about gay rights or, rights for people who, to some degree, have same-sex attractions. Now, the role of the Conservative Party in this story is often remembered, I think, now in public imagination through the prism of one law in particular, and that is Section 28, which basically put a prohibition on schools and public sector bodies from promoting, in the words of the law, homosexuality as a legitimate lifestyle.
As a pretended family relationship.
Now, this is really remembered as being a homophobic piece of legislation. You don't have to think the law was right to necessarily think the situation is rather more complicated than that. But we're not really here to try and relitigate that debate. But I mention it only to say that that is very often how the Conservative Party in the 20th century, at least, is remembered on the subject of gay rights. But that's not the only view within the Conservative Party. It is not a case that the Conservative Party is almost monotheistically homophobic. There are people within the Conservative Party, in fact, organised people and groups within the Conservative Party, who are making the case for homosexual equality. In particular, Richard, this group called the Tory Campaign for Homosexual Equality. So who were they and what were they up to?
Yes, so the Tory Campaign for Homosexual Equality began in 1977 as the Conservative Group for Homosexual Equality, CGHE. This was an inhospitable time for people who were openly gay and involved in politics. It's around this time that a Labour MP called Maureen Colquhoun, who was a Northampton MP, is outed as a lesbian and is living with her lesbian partner. She had divorced her husband and had moved in with her lesbian partner, I think, while she was an MP. And she was deselected by her local Labour Party. So this was not a time when you had, say, the Tory party as the anti-gay rights party and the Labour Party as a pro-gay rights party. There was certainly a lot of homophobia in both parties. And when CGHE was first set up, the Conservative Party wanted to have nothing to do with it. In fact, they were even banned from using the Torch of Liberty, which was the logo of the Conservative Party in the 1980s, 90s, and noughties until it was replaced with a tree, by David Cameron. And
I'm a big fan of the tree, by the way. I think the tree is a superb logo. But never mind.
Opinions may differ. And so this Torch of Liberty, which was brought in during Thatcher's time as leader in the 1980s, was something that they were not allowed to use on their branding, lest people think that the CGHE had a formal linkage with the Conservative Party. And it was during this time that the leader of the CGHE, Dr. David Starkey, who some people may be familiar with as a somewhat controversial historian still today, decided to change the name from the Conservative Group for Homosexual Equality to the Tory Campaign for Homosexual Equality, Torch, which was therefore an oblique reference to the Torch of Liberty, although it caused some confusion at the time because people weren't quite sure if the acronym TORCHE was to be pronounced torch. Some people called it torch. Some people called it torche, which was dismissed as excessively camp. Anyway, they were the group that was basically an unofficial ginger group of the Conservative Party that was trying to push the party to be more inclusive for gay people. Right up until the new millennium, that the Conservative Party kept Torch at arm's length. And so it remained outside of the formal auspices of the Conservative Party right up until Theresa May became chairman of the Conservative Party in 2002.
So I think a way to characterize the Conservative Party in the latter part of the 20th century is that there is a dominant view, which is skeptical of social liberalism in general and gay rights in particular, but there is within the party, officially or unofficially in varying guises, a group of people in Parliament and more broadly within the activist class who are making these arguments for it. So let's go forward to when Theresa May gets elected to Parliament. That's in 1997. She becomes the MP for Maidenhead. And as we begin to look at what she thought about these issues, one of my observations is that in some ways it's quite hard to know because two things happen in the late 1990s that are really relevant for Theresa May. One of them is that, of course, the 1997 election is a bloodbath for the Conservative Party. And therefore, there aren't that many Conservative MPs in the House of Commons, 165 at the time. And the second is that she is a capable member of Parliament. And so she very quickly starts to make her way up the shadow ministerial ranks. And within just a couple of years, she's in fact in the shadow cabinet. So to what extent, Richard, can we really get a sense of what Theresa May thinks during her early time as an MP? And in particular, how does she approach what are really two of probably the most salient votes in this space at the time? One of them being the repeal of Section 28, which we've briefly discussed, and the other one being the equalisation of the age of consent between gay people to be the same as between heterosexual people.
Yeah, so during her first term in Parliament, she doesn't rock the boat at all on matters relating to gay rights. She follows the Conservative whip very loyally on these issues. So that means that she votes against the Labour government's moves to equalise the age of consent for homosexuals, bringing it down to 16 as it is for heterosexuals. She also votes against same-sex adoption. She also votes against the repeal of Section 28. To the extent that we have any clue of what her personal views are on this, by the time that the vote to repeal Section 28 comes about in the year 2000, Theresa May is now in the shadow cabinet. She's shadow education secretary. This, of course, therefore falls within her brief because this is relating to local authority schools. And she never defends Section 28 as a good thing. She gives an interview where she says that she doesn't believe it's enforced. So she doesn't think it's a good use of government time to spend time trying to repeal it, that she had sought assurances from teachers and head teachers that they felt that they were able to stamp out homophobic bullying at schools, even under the Section 28 framework. And so she claimed that she'd been reassured by these consultations that she'd had informally. And therefore, basically, there was no point for the Labour government trying to repeal it. And it did actually take a great deal of government energy to repeal it because The House of Lords initially voted down the repeal of Section 28. The Labour government had only a few months earlier removed over 600 mostly conservative members of the House of Lords through its House of Lords reform, where it booted out most of the hereditary peers who were overwhelmingly conservative. So this should have rebalanced politically in the eyes of the Labour government, the House of Lords. But even then, Labour couldn't get the legislation through initially. So her point was, this isn't really affecting anyone. This is taking up a lot of government time. You should be spending your time on more useful things.
Then already by her second term in Parliament, she continues to be on the Tory front bench. In fact, she becomes party chairman. And I think you can begin to see a change in her tone. At the general level, of course, this is a moment when she says, probably actually one of the most famous things that Theresa May ever says. If I'm thinking off the top of my head now, but what are the great Theresa May quotes? There's Brexit means Brexit, the slightly nebulous phrase that she used in 2016 for her leadership campaign.
There's her comment about if you're a citizen of nowhere.
There's probably the citizen of nowhere speech, yeah, which has been much misinterpreted, I think, over time, and was in and of itself a very interesting view about sort of small c conservatism and relationships between people and the state.
She made some speech about an asylum seeker not being able to be deported because they had a pet cat.
Yeah, that's maybe at the more trivial end of things. Similarly, at the trivial and end of things, of course, there's the moment where her voice breaks when she resigns and speaks about the country that she loves just outside 10 Downing Street. But maybe actually the most famous thing that she says at all is not when she is a very senior member of the government or prime minister, but is when she's party chairman in the early noughties, because she says that there are people out there, critics of the Conservative Party, who think of them as the nasty party. Now, this has been much, much quoted ever since. The reason why I mention the nasty party speech is that what I think you can see there is a sense of Theresa May trying to diagnose a problem within the Conservative Party about how large chunks of the country saw it at the time, and to try and get the party to really think seriously about how it is perceived. So, Richard, do you think this is a time when you can see Theresa May basically being unhappy with the collective responsibility that she's had to go through as a member of the front bench on these social questions? And when you begin to see Theresa May's real views coming out?
Well, I agree with you that it is a important moment in May's political journey, particularly on this issue, where she does seem to feel freer to speak out in a way that she hadn't before. I should point out, though, that Theresa May is not the person who coined the nasty party comment. It was actually, I have found evidence that it was said by another Conservative MP called Damien Green 5 months before she gave her conference speech, where he said that the nasty party can't become the nice party overnight.
Interestingly, I mean, Theresa May and Damien Green were at Oxford together and both became Conservative MPs at the same time. And when she was Prime Minister, she made him, I don't think formally, but informally, Deputy Prime Minister. So it would not be an enormous leap for that thought to have gone from him to her.
Oh, that's really interesting. I didn't realize that they went so far back together. Yeah, so she's made chairman, and it was chairman. They didn't change the title because a woman was put in place. Although The Guardian refused to recognize this, they said that the Guardian House Style Guide would change the name to chairwoman. Quote, although the Conservatives describe her as the new chairman, we have decided to call her the party chairwoman. She is, after all, a woman, and if the Tories want to look daft and out of touch, that is up to them.
It's interesting. I think the Tory party chairman is still always known as chairman now. I can't think of somebody who's taken the title chairwoman. And probably no matter which you take, it's preferable to what happens now in lots of council chambers where the chair of the council is just called chair all of the time, which is obviously a little ridiculous.
Yes, well, that's the approach in the Labour Party. We've transformed the role from a person to a bit of furniture. and we just take out the person element and it's just a chair. So she's made chairman in July 2002. She gives this speech at her first party conference as party chairman in October of 2002. And she says in it, not just this famous line, "You know what people call us, the nasty party," but she also attacks unnamed colleagues who, quote, "make political capital out of demonizing minorities." And so that's sort of the first hint, demonizing minorities. That gives you a sense of that she's thinking potentially of gay people as part of that. She didn't win a lot of favors from her colleagues for these comments. David Davis said that she was doing Labour's work for them. Norman Tebbit, who'd been party chairman under Margaret Thatcher, said that the Conservatives were rather a bit more popular when they were the nasty party. But she doubled down on this, and the following year she was even more explicit in her conference speech. She said, quote, "Rich or poor, straight or gay, black or white, whoever you are, wherever you're from, the Conservative Party is for you." Now, one journalist observed that she was speaking to an audience where, quote, "few of them seem to be any of those things, though one can never tell about the gays."
It's one of those lines that sounds quite good, but of course it's quite obviously not true, because there are different times when the same journalist, I'm sure, might have wanted to point out that large parts of a Tory conference hall is in fact rich, straight and white. So it's not a very good line, really.
No, that's a good point, actually. But anyway, the fact that she made this appeal to people who were straight or gay is then followed up a couple of months later when Theresa May formally recognises Torch, or Torch, or Torche, the Tory campaign for homosexual equality, as an official affiliated group within the Conservative Party. Now, that group is still affiliated to the Conservative Party. It became eventually LGB Tory, and then abandoning all efforts at wordplay, it became LGBT plus Conservatives, which I think is its current name. And to the point in your question, Lee, it is interesting that she sees now, although she's still in the shadow cabinet, she sees now her party leadership role as actually an opportunity for her to develop the party's positioning on this issue in a way, for example, where when she was shadow education secretary, when the repeal of Section 28 was going through, she clearly didn't really like Section 28, but she didn't feel that she was in a position to push back. But here now, as party chairman under Ian Duncan Smith, who was the Conservative leader at the time, she feels more able to actually criticise the party. I'd be interested to know what your thoughts are on that, Lee. Why do you think that was the case? Do you think Ian Duncan Smith kind of gave her more space than William Hague had given her to develop her own political message? Was it because Ian Duncan Smith was relatively weak, so she felt more able to push against him? Was it the fact of the defeat of the 2001 election was so bad for the Conservatives that she felt it was a matter of political survival for the Conservative Party to change its image? What are your thoughts on that?
She clearly felt confident and strong in her position within the shadow cabinet, to the extent that she could rock the boat somewhat. And I suspect that was down to a few things. One of them undoubtedly being Ian Duncan Smith's weakness as leader at this time. Of course, he would eventually be challenged with a confidence vote. He would lose that vote and he would be defenestrated. And it's a general pattern that you see, like when the leader is weak, other members of the cabinet or the shadow cabinet feel that they can take some more latitude because they don't feel that the leader is strong enough to get rid of them. If we take a very recent contemporary example of that, when Wes Streeting voluntarily released lots of his WhatsApps between him and Peter Mandelson, there were plenty of things in there that did break collective responsibility of the government. It basically says the government's got no strategy for growth and all the rest of it. There are times when if you would publicly put out statements yourself to say those things, you would basically be resigning from government. But Wes Streeting feels like it's in his interest to release that information at this time, and that the Prime Minister is too weak to get rid of him. It's a gamble, but it's probably one that Streeting has judged correctly. And I suspect May felt similarly, that she was in fact in a position of relative strength. What makes it really interesting, though, is that Ian Duncan Smith's leadership, I think, is consequential in several ways. One of them is that it's actually a time when one of the big divides in Conservative politics, namely Europe, does not look that fiery. in the sense that under his leadership, the question of Britain and the single currency and the Conservative view on it is basically settled. And his decisive victory over Ken Clarke, for example, the Tories' great Europhile of this period in the 2001 leadership election, helped settle some of that debate. And the sting starts to go out of that somewhat, at least, of course, temporarily. But if that's to his credit, one of Duncan Smith's failings is that he allows social policy to be exposed as a big division within the party, in part by imposing whips on votes that really could have been free votes.
And I should just correct something I said earlier about same-sex adoption. That was actually under Ian Duncan Smith rather than William Hague, and it caused John Bercow to resign as Shadow Work and Pension Secretary in order to vote in favour of it.
And there are other examples as well. So, for example, there's a vote on unmarried couples adopting. That's not within the canon of gay or transgender rights, but it is within social policy, where some very up-and-coming Conservative MPs, David Cameron, George Osborne, and Boris Johnson, refused to take the whip on it. And so this actually becomes a period where there's quite a lot of division within the Conservative Party on social policy, and where I think you can see where Theresa May is planting herself within that divide, and it's not with her own party leader. These years, I think, then become a period of really quite consequential transition in terms of how the Conservative Party views social policy. So by the time Duncan Smith goes towards the end of 2003 and is replaced by Michael Howard, I think Michael Howard takes a much more pragmatic view of lots of these questions. So, for example, when civil partnerships comes up, the precursor to same-sex marriage, he makes it a free vote. And so Conservative MPs can vote however they like without running the risk of breaking the whip. A good piece of party management, and also for an issue like that, which is seen as being an issue with moral dimensions to it. It's not a clear-cut thing, what is a moral question and what isn't. But I think it was a very sensible thing for Michael Howard to do. Before we come on to the final part of that transition, actually, because David Cameron, of course, is in the third staging post between Duncan Smith, Howard, and where the Conservative Party ends up in the late noughties on social policy. I just did want to pause to reflect briefly on Michael Howard's leadership, because he gives Theresa May this unique position. He calls her the Shadow Secretary of State for the Family. Now, it's a fairly brief role. She is the only person to ever have held it, because it isn't actually shadowing anything. There's no equivalent role in the government, but it is used as a signal that the Tory party cares about family-friendly policies. In that sense, it's rather like when Jeremy Corbyn had a shadow minister for peace. There was nothing to shadow, but it was a signal about where the party sat and what its agenda was. So how does Theresa May use this somewhat invented role?
Well, again, a bit like with her period as chairman of the Conservative Party, she uses it to shift the dial within the Conservative Party on same-sex families. So although you might think from a name like Shadow Secretary of State for the Family, this is a very right-wing, conservative-coded kind of fake office. In fact, Theresa May said that she wanted to use this role to, quote, change the definition of who was a family. And she said that she wanted to include gay couples within the definition of a family. And she said, quote, that she would stand up for them and not judge them. And she urged the Conservative Party to, quote, live in the real world when it came to different types of families. And it is interesting that, so just at that moment of transition within the Conservative Party from Ian Duncan Smith to Michael Howard, when she's moved from chairman to Shadow Secretary of State for the Family, she is the honoured guest at the annual dinner of the Tory campaign for homosexual equality. And it is a dinner that's put on in her honour to recognise her role in finally, after at that point, it would have been 25 years of this organisation having existed, finally being given a formal footing within the Conservative Party, and she was credited to that. And as you mentioned, when civil partnerships come in, she votes in favour of them. It's actually from the Conservative shadow front bench, from the Conservative front bench, it's seen as her ministry's role to shadow the government legislation. And curiously, she declines the lead the Conservative Party's on the debate on this. And some of her critics from the LGBT community have criticized her for this and seen this as evidence that she wasn't really totally signed up to civil partnerships, even though she voted in favor of them. But I think it's really important to understand who she invited to speak at the dispatch box on civil partnerships from the Conservative Party, and that was her junior shadow minister, Alan Duncan. And that, I think, is significant because Alan Duncan was openly gay, one of the very first openly gay Conservative MPs. And so I think she did that. She's a nice thing for him to give him that sort of moment in history to speak positively about the legislation as a Conservative and a gay Conservative, rather than her sort of shirking her responsibility because she was uncomfortable with the legislation.
I'm certain that that is correct as an explanation for what she did. The final stage in the transition of the Conservative leadership that we've been discussing is, of course, David Cameron's leadership from December 2005 onwards. And he embraces an altogether more progressive view of social issues. I actually think Cameron's view on it is very interesting. It's not a popular view within people who think about conservatism now, but I actually think David Cameron is one of the more fundamentally small c conservative leaders that the Conservative Party has had in a very long time, but that it manifests itself in two ways, which has had him cast in a rather different role. One of them is that there's a very long-standing conservative tradition of not necessarily trying to turn the clock back, but rather saying, well, we accept the position as it is when we assume power, and we almost try and stop radical progressive ideas from going further. I actually think that is a big part of what David Cameron was like. And David Cameron as Prime Minister at almost any other time could have actually been a very different David Cameron as Prime Minister, because he would have accepted, broadly speaking, the settlement as it was then. That's an aside, though. The bit that's more relevant to this is that David Cameron, I think, in some respects, actually does have socially conservative ideas, but not in the way that they are traditionally understood. So quite clearly, he is somebody who believes in the family rather than anarchic social relations or a state of enemy between people within society. You can see that from the policies he advocates, certainly when he's leader of the opposition before going into office, for family-friendly tax breaks. You can see that, I think, in the way in which he speaks about the importance of family very consistently as a politician. And I actually think you can see that in the way in which he advocates as Prime Minister for same-sex marriage. I remember being sat in the conference hall in either Manchester or Birmingham, I forget which, when he makes the case for same-sex marriage and says that he doesn't support it in spite of being a Conservative. He supports it because he's a Conservative. Now, some people will reject that claim, but I think he sees, and this would be also my view for what it's worth, marriage as being an essential social bond, and that the more people who are in long-term relationships who get married, and therefore that have that stability and that anchoring in life, the better. And whilst some people may disagree with that, there is, I think, a coherent and conservative view there. All of which is a very roundabout way of asking Richard, presumably by this time, when Cameron is leader, Theresa May finds that she's got a leader with whom she can not necessarily jar with in the way she may have done with Duncan Smith, but align herself with on lots of these questions.
Yes, I mean, David Cameron says that the Tory party has to be at peace with the modern world. He calls for the end of the party's, quote, curtain-twitching moralism. And in many ways, the Cameron leadership, the Cameron modernization, is the fruition of what Theresa May had been calling for in the early noughties in her conference speeches in 2002 and 2003. And so certainly she was along, she went along for the ride on that. I mean, she was certainly supportive of those efforts as leader of the opposition. I think it's worth noting that actually, as we sort of have, that in some ways already began under Michael Howard, with Howard's decision, for example, not to put a whip on civil partnerships and to allow for the Conservative front bench actually to speak in the debate in favourable terms about civil partnerships. So, of course, Cameron takes it much further and is much better at packaging it. But there is already a change that occurred between Duncan Smith and Michael Howard.
In 2010, of course, the government of the country changes. And David Cameron faces one of his biggest challenges, I think, of party management. He's got to simultaneously cope with the fact that many Conservatives hoped that there would be a majority Conservative government at the 2010 election, and that isn't achieved, in spite of a very remarkable number of gains at that election. And he has to manage that disappointment alongside disappointing some very senior Conservatives, because even though the Conservatives, of course, do go into government, they do so as part of a coalition. And so there are quite a lot of Conservative MPs on the front bench who don't get the job that they hoped for. Some of them get bumped further down the hierarchy, and some of them get kicked all the way to the back benches. One of the very, very few winners in that scenario is Theresa May, who is actually promoted upon entering government in 2010 and becomes Home Secretary. Of course, she remains there then for 6 years until she becomes Prime Minister. As a slight aside, it's interesting to reflect that after 18 months in office, Sir Keir Starmer is on to his second Home Secretary of this Labour government. And there is talk of another Labour reshuffle taking place soon, perhaps to try and save the Prime Minister's own skin. Maybe he'll then be on his third. Whereas Cameron has the same Home Secretary and the same Chancellor throughout his entire time as Prime Minister. And for most of his first term, he keeps the same Foreign Secretary in William Hague. And it's only when Hague signals that he wants to leave Parliament at the 2015 election that he gets replaced as Foreign Secretary. So really, this period under Cameron, it's not always remembered this way, but it's a remarkably stable period of government in spite of being a coalition. And the hallmark of that stability really is the personnel at the top, including George Osborne, but also clearly including Theresa May. When she enters the Home Office, Richard, this great office of state that she's handed in 2010, to what extent do LGBT issues appear on her desk?
We should also remember that she was at this time also Minister for Women and Equalities. So she would have seen LGBT issues as falling within a ministerial brief that she held as well. But you can sort of see how rapidly she moves on some of this stuff. So in June of 2010, a month after the government's formed, Cameron hosts a pride reception at Downing Street, in the garden of Downing Street, and he co-hosts it with Theresa May, and Theresa May gives a speech at this reception where she talks about how she is going to pursue initiatives to tackle anti-gay bullying in schools. She is going to look into the opportunity to register gay relationships in religious settings, and she's going to launch a great big action plan on transgender rights. More of that later. An early controversy that she faces in the Home Office is about whether people can use sexuality as grounds for claiming asylum. Under the previous Labour government, the government's position was no. Even if you came from a country that criminalized homosexuality, perhaps even executed gay people, the fact that you yourself were gay was not seen as valid grounds for an asylum claim in Britain. And the official advice of the Labour Home Office was if you were gay and you came from such a country, you would be deported and sent back to that country and instructed to live a discreet and sexually chaste life. And that meant that under Labour, 98% of asylum claimants who use sexuality as the primary grounds for their asylum claim were rejected. And Theresa May was strongly against this. She vowed she would not deport any gay asylum seekers to countries where homosexuality was a crime. 2 months after she made that declaration, the UK Supreme Court also backed up two asylum claimants who challenged this under the ECHR, I believe, and the Supreme Court said that the UK government couldn't deport people back to countries, gay people back to countries where homosexuality was persecuted. And Theresa May celebrated this judgment and basically said, she welcomed the judgment. This was something that she would have done anyway if the judgment hadn't been handed down as quickly as it had. Lord Hope, who issued the judgment, had a rather curious way of putting it. He said that he hoped that as a result of this judgment, gay men granted asylum in Britain would be, quote, free to go to Kylie concerts, drinking exotically coloured cocktails and talking about boys, just as straight men are able to enjoy themselves playing rugby, drinking beer, and talking about girls. I think a kind-hearted sentiment, if somewhat awkwardly put. But yes, Theresa May said, "I do not believe it is acceptable to send people home and expect them to hide their sexuality to avoid persecution," and therefore the Conservative Lib Dem government fully backed this. So it's actually a huge reversal in our asylum policies that happens quite early on in the coalition government.
And of course, it ends up being hugely consequential. I think it's an interesting case study because it's a sign of how, well, tricky it is to govern. It's always tricky to govern. But even when you think you're adopting a morally virtuous position, then it rarely, if ever, comes without complications. So I don't think there's anybody in government or, in fact, in the country at all who would want somebody to suffer persecution or torture or death on the grounds of their sexuality if they were deported back to the country from which they came. I think there'd be a general overwhelming repulsion to the idea of that. But if you're to make it easier for people who are gay and could suffer that to claim asylum in the UK, then what you basically end up doing is you create an incentive to identify in that way if you want asylum. Now, I know some people will balk at the idea of me saying that, but personally, I think it's a statement of the entirely obvious. And that's not to say that granting asylum to people who find themselves in that situation is wrong. But it is to say that what you end up doing there, you create this sort of moral hazard whereby it's possible for people to say that when it isn't true, because ultimately what they want to try and achieve is asylum. And so it comes with consequences, unintended consequences, which can have a long tail and be quite problematic.
And the implementation of this change in policy became quite fraught because Home Office officials who reviewed asylum claims were accused of pursuing invasive lines of questioning about claimants' sexual behavior and their experience of same-sex sexual behavior. And Theresa May, when she found out about this, thought that that was too intrusive. She instructed them to focus instead not on sexual behavior, but on sexual orientation. And so the questions shifted to more about questions about attraction rather than sexual behavior. And in doing that, it actually made it easier for claimants to win their asylum grounds on the basis of sexuality than it had been even initially after the change in policy.
It is just a very difficult issue. If somebody is being persecuted on grounds of something that they cannot prove when they make their asylum claim, then how do you reasonably judge that? It's a genuinely very tricky issue. One of the things that sticks in my mind from this period when Theresa May was Home Secretary, to some degree predates it as well, actually, to when Gordon Brown was Prime Minister, is this question of historic criminal convictions for things that were illegal, but then were decriminalised. For example, homosexual acts between consenting adults prior to the late 1960s, or when there were varying ages of consent and somebody was prosecuted for doing something which by this stage would have been totally legal, but at the time, because of the ages of consent, was illegal. So that is a fight that Theresa May took on as well.
Yes, she made it clear that she believed that these prosecutions for consensual sexual acts between men over the age of 16 should be overturned, both for those who were still living with those convictions to clear their criminal record, but also she supported the posthumous pardoning of Alan Turing, who was the mathematician who had contributed to breaking the Nazi code during the Second World War that gave the Allies a crucial advantage in winning the war. And when Turing was about 40, he was in a sexual relationship with a 19-year-old, which was prosecuted, and he was found guilty of gross decency. And some people argue that that conviction led to him taking his own life, although there's some dispute over the details of that. And so Theresa May lobbied David Cameron to advise the Queen to pardon Alan Turing for that offence, which the Queen did. And in 2017, by this point, Theresa May was prime minister, she was able to actually put in law an overturning of these convictions, which was known informally as Alan Turing's law. And Theresa May supported putting Alan Turing on the £50 banknote, which I think he still is on the banknote.
I would check, but I don't have any.
Yes, I haven't seen one in quite some time.
Well, you've mentioned, of course, what listeners will all know, that she becomes Prime Minister. She replaces David Cameron in 2016, and throughout that time she has one overriding objective above all else, which of course is to deliver the outcome of the referendum and to take Britain out of the European Union. It's no great spoiler to the future episode we're going to do on Brexit to say that she fails to do that. But as that becomes the all-absorbing task of government, to what extent does this, I think we can now say, a clear commitment to advancing LGBT issues in government? I think she demonstrates that very clearly as Prime Minister. To what extent does that remain on her agenda and something she feels able to do?
Well, yes, actually, I mean, I should say that it briefly featured in the Conservative leadership election of 2016. So Theresa May's opponent in that election, Andrea Leadsom, eventually had to drop out because of comments she made about Theresa May not having any children and how this somehow made her less likely to have a stake in the future of the nation than Andrea Leadsom. But there was also controversy where Andrea Leadsom had said that she wasn't a great fan of same-sex marriage, which had been brought in by the Cameron government, although a majority of Conservative MPs opposed it, and Theresa May was supportive of it. In fact, I forgot to say earlier, but when Theresa May was a shadow minister under David Cameron, she was the author of a policy document which recommended bringing in same-sex marriage. So she was seen as someone who had advocated same-sex marriage as Conservative policy for quite some time. And when Andrea Leadsom criticised same-sex marriage, Ruth Davidson, who was the leader of the Scottish Conservatives and is herself a lesbian, came out and said that she thought Theresa May had a much better record on LGBT rights. And she said, quote, "I'm very happy that there are people here who have been proponents of equality like Theresa May. I'm very pleased that Theresa May was instrumental in bringing forward same-sex marriage." As Prime Minister, as you say, she had a lot on her plate, but she still continued to advocate for LGBT issues. So this LGBTQ action plan, which she had mentioned at the very start of the Cameron government, had finally completed its research. You might say, gosh, that took a long time, and it did. But part of the reason it took a long time is there's absolutely an enormous scale of a research document. Over 100,000 LGBT people were interviewed by government researchers for this plan. I mean, the scale of resources that must have been put behind this must have been enormous. And the plan resulted in 75 different policy changes that it recommended that government pursue. And Theresa May committed to implementing them. And during her time as Prime Minister, she did actually implement a great deal of those. She found money in the budget, nearly £5 million, in what she called her LGBT implementation fund to fund the implementation of this policy review. One example of that is the change in the relationships and sex education curriculum for England, which hadn't been updated since 2000, and Theresa May supported changing the RSE curriculum to talk about same-sex relations, to talk about gender self-identification, to introduce the concept of same-sex relations to children as young as primary school ages. And this was actually very controversial. And of course, it's a direct repudiation of the policies of the Conservative Party in the 1980s, 1990s, and early 2000s, because it's basically flipping Section 28 on its head and going from a policy of saying schools and local authorities should not promote in any way or really even discuss same-sex relationships as a quote-unquote pretended family relationship, to saying as a matter of government policy, schools must teach that they are on equal footing to traditional heterosexual families.
I want to come on to focus on transgender issues. So far, we've chiefly talked about issues of people who have same-sex attractions. But I think that by the time May is Prime Minister, many people would argue that lots of the legislative measures required for gay equality have been implemented. I mean, you've spoken about many of them. Repeal of historic convictions, repeal of Section 28, anti-discrimination laws are in place and well established by this time. There's same-sex marriage, of course. That's not to say that there aren't societal issues and challenges at the same time, and that's a separate debate. But I think the areas where even activists think that legislation is required basically cease. But activists don't have that view on transgender issues. They want to go much further than, say, the Gender Recognition Act of 2004 did. And Theresa May appears to embrace trans rights, really, more than any of her predecessors as Prime Minister.
I think that's absolutely right. I would say Theresa May is the most pro-trans Prime Minister in British history. The background to this is in 2002, the European Court of Human Rights ruled that the British government had to change its laws relating to gender recognition. It said that the inability of a transgender person to be fully legally recognized in their chosen gender was a breach of their human rights. And so this effectively compelled the Labour government under Tony Blair in 2004 to pass the Gender Recognition Act. And the Gender Recognition Act says that a person can be legally recognized in their new gender under law if they receive a diagnosis of gender dysphoria from 2 medical doctors, and they demonstrate evidence of living in their acquired gender for a minimum of 2 years. And Theresa May was, by this point, when she's Prime Minister, a critic of the legislation. She called it bureaucratic and invasive. She said being trans is not an illness and should not be treated as such. And so she embraced the view of pro-trans campaigners who argued that the Gender Recognition Act, although a step in the right direction, was not a step far enough because it medicalized gender transition when gender transition, in their view, should be a question of personal self-identification. In the end, Theresa May was unable to pass the legislation that she wanted to bring about that would have changed the Gender Recognition Act to remove the role of the doctors in this. It became, of course, a very controversial issue when the Scottish government did so, and the government advised the Crown to withhold assent on that bill, which is effectively a veto of the UK government over the devolved parliament, which is perfectly constitutionally appropriate, whatever one's views are on the issue itself. But it's very, very, very rarely done. And so, in fact, I think it was the first time it had ever been done. I think it's just clear to me that it would not have been something Theresa May would have done. So I think if Theresa May had stayed on as Prime Minister, if Brexit hadn't taken her out as it did in 2019, I think that she would have changed the legislation in Britain, or certainly would have tried to do so. If she had a sufficient majority, then I think she would have succeeded. And she would have, I think, allowed the Scottish Government to change the law in Scotland.
To bring this episode to a close, just a couple of observations from me. There were those in the LGBT plus rights activist groups who basically reject Theresa May's conversion to their cause. And I find that totally baffling. And I think it says more about her critics, really, than it does about May herself. I mean, if you're an activist, surely converting people to your cause is the number one thing that you want to happen. Not to then chastise them for not having agreed with you earlier. And I've always found that a really baffling thing, that when sometimes you get people who will say about Theresa May, yes, she did all of these things, but oh, well, back in 1998, she voted the wrong way and so and so. So, well, what is the point of your activism if not to win people over? I mean, if ever I'm door knocking, for example, for a political cause to parochialize and maybe trivialize it slightly, if somebody says to me, oh, I've never voted for your party before, but I will do this time, I don't say, well, what the hell were you thinking last time, you fool? I welcome the fact that they're now on side. And it's really baffled me always that you get some activists who don't take that view. And I think actually what it says is it basically shows how when you have campaign groups that are oriented around interests and you have a political system that is oriented around parties, they often don't sit very easily together. And there will be people who simply do not like the fact that it is Theresa May who was so progressive on these issues and agreed with them and feel they have to put some distance between that. The second thing I wanted to say was to try and put it into context, really, Theresa May, with where we are now, particularly by thinking of her as somebody who, so far as I can tell, basically gave LGBT campaign groups pretty much everything they wanted when she had the power to do so, at least before she left office in the pretty traumatic circumstances in which she did. And for me, I find it really interesting that having been behind the curve, so to speak, in the late 1990s and early 2000s on issues like equalization of the age of consent, for example, she then runs ahead of the curve by her own time as Prime Minister, particularly on transgender issues. And she ends up adopting positions not at the same time or behind where the centre ground of the country may be on those questions, but actually, I think, significantly in advance of where the country found itself at the time, and certainly where her party found itself on those questions. And that, I think, has now put her legacy in a really interesting position, because quite often on social issues, you can see the advancement of rights for minority groups as basically a self-propelling train that has its own momentum and is relentlessly and unavoidably and inevitably going to get to a more progressive position. Because, of course, that's what it has done on women's rights for the most part. That's what it's done on rights for people of minority ethnicities and races. That's what it's done for gay people, etc. And you can see that, well, that is just the inevitable trajectory. And in many ways, you should get ahead of it to save retrospectively being labelled as a bigot. But really, on the transgender question, I think many campaign groups, including and most notably women's rights groups, have argued compellingly and successfully that actually the continued advancement of claims by people who have changed their sex or gender does come at the cost of the rights of women, for example, around single-sex spaces. And therefore, since Theresa May was Prime Minister, I actually think it's probably the case that not only have the arguments that she made not progressed or been more widely adopted, but actually the centre ground of where society and our politics is slightly rolled backwards. I don't say that as a positive or a negative, just as an observation of where I think we find ourselves now. And so I wonder whether or not we can say that Theresa May wasn't just the most pro-trans prime minister up to that point, but could possibly end up being the most pro-trans prime minister this country ever has, because the debate has not moved in the direction that she was expecting and embracing.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult to know precisely where these issues end up. Some people might view the more recent turn to more gender critical center ground as a temporary setback. Some might say actually this is a course correction that is likely to endure, and it's difficult to read the tea leaves on that. But what I would say about Theresa May is that I think this is genuine on her part. I don't think this is particularly her trying to gain political favor one way or another for doing it. I mean, if you listen to the way that she talks about LGBT issues, she often will use quite emotional language. I don't mean that in a critical way. I don't mean to use that word because she's a woman, but in the sense that it's coming from her heart and her moral convictions. She has denounced gay conversion therapy, which is something that she also tried to ban, but ran out of time effectively to do that, as disgusting and an abhorrent practice. When her LGBTQ action plan, that huge survey of over 100,000 gay and trans people came out, she talked about how upset she was, how moved she was, and she sounded upset when she talked about it, when she learned that 2/3 of same-sex couples declined to hold each other's hands in public for fear of social backlash. And she said, that really struck me because for heterosexual couples, holding hands is such a simple, normal gesture that we take entirely for granted. And there are also just like other little signs in her time as prime minister and as home secretary where she does things that weren't necessarily for her own personal gain, but just because she wanted to be a nice person to people who were LGBT, who she thought were mistreated. So there's an example of a drag queen who, when Theresa May is prime minister, she heard this drag queen had been bullied, and she wrote a note to the drag queen sympathizing and encouraging this person, which we know not because of Theresa May releasing it, but because then this individual, whose name escapes me, then made a big deal about it. But Theresa May didn't necessarily need to expect that that would be the case. She invited Peter Tatchell to Downing Street, Peter Tatchell being a very long established gay rights campaigner who he claims, I have no idea if it's true, but he claims was blacklisted by every previous prime minister from going to Downing Street. But Theresa May brings him to Downing Street. She basically celebrates him, even though his politics were very different from her politics. Theresa May is fundamentally, at least on this issue, I think a conviction politician. Her earlier votes in that first term in Parliament, I think, probably were not her genuine views, and you could criticize her for that. But on the other hand, she waited until she got to a particular moment, a position of power within the party chairman, and then effectively continued to, once she got it into a position of power, to advocate for what she believed was right. And you could say, well, she could have, as a backbencher, rebelled and so on, and she put her political career ahead of that. But on the other hand, you might say, well, she was tactical. And if she had been too much of a rebel at the earlier stages, then she might not have actually arrived in a position of power where she would have been able to make a difference. And that is a ongoing fundamental dilemma of politics, is how much must you compromise the purity of one's position in order to achieve the power that helps you get closer to the position that you believe in.
We finish as ever with a discussion of the books that we're reading at the moment. I'll go first. This week I dipped into a book from 1964 called A Source Book of Conservatism, put together by Geoffrey D. Now, this was produced by the Conservative Political Centre. So people who have listened to the podcast over the longer term will have heard me speak about the CPC in the past. It was a forerunner to something that is now called the Conservative Policy Forum, and basically existed in order to try and develop among the conservative grassroots a better understanding of politics and to stimulate debate about political ideas. And this book was put together really as a forerunner to the internet, in a sense. So a huge chunk of it, most of the first half really, is a bibliography of biographies and reference works about the history of the Conservative Party up to 1964. And of course, that function now isn't really necessary to put into a book itself. But there were then chapters in this book which are really interesting. And the one I looked into this week was on party colours at elections. Now, this was prompted by a conversation I ended up having by chance by somebody whose father had been a Conservative MP more than half a century ago in a part of the country where the Tory colours were pink at the time. And it's basically the case that right up until the latter half of the 20th century, there was not a great deal of uniformity in terms of the colours that political parties used. Certainly within the Conservative Party, it wasn't until 1949 that the Central Council of the National Union, which is part of the then voluntary wing of the party, passed a resolution that blue would be the official party colour in all constituencies. And even after that, variations continued to exist. So in Bromley, which was at the time represented by Harold Macmillan, it wasn't until 1961 that they voted to change their colours from orange and purple to royal blue. In the early 1960s, there were parts of Cambridgeshire, Lincolnshire, Rutland, and the Isle of Ely, and even some parts of Norfolk where the Conservative colour was pink, or in some cases pink and white, or pink and purple. Plenty of parts of the country in the early mid-20th century had Conservatives or Unionists in Scotland that used the colours red, white, and blue, riffing on the colours of the flag rather than just the blue of Conservatism. And even parts of the country, including bits of West London, where red was the Conservative colour, right up until the 1950s. Of course, this has now been homogenised to the point that no matter where you are in the United Kingdom, the Conservative Party is blue and the Labour Party is red and the Liberal Party is yellow. But this has very often not been the case. A little bit of our history that is dead now, but I think interesting and perhaps worth revisiting. Maybe not as its own full podcast, but perhaps a bonus for the Patreon at some stage. Richard, what are you reading at the moment?
I've actually heard that the advent of coloured television accelerated this homogeneity of rosettes as people started to wonder why were these candidates all in different parts of the country wearing the different rosettes, and of course colour photography as well. Right up until the mid-20th century, most political imagery that people would consume in the media would have been black and white, so they wouldn't have necessarily seen the variation in colour until the latter half of the 20th century. The book I wanted to recommend this week is called Statecraft: Policies and Politics under Prime Minister Theresa May, edited by Andrew Rowe Crines and David Geoffrey. Now, the rather obvious reason why I've recommended this book is because it's the book that contains my chapter on Theresa May and her record on LGBT issues. I'm not really sure why I was ever asked to write the chapter, to be honest, as I'm not a historian of the Conservative Party, but I enjoyed writing it, and there are some good anecdotes, I think, in the chapter. So the book is ruinously expensive. It's one of these awful academic publishers who charge over £100 for the book. But if listeners are interested in reading my chapter, feel free to contact me and I'll send you a copy of my chapter. There are many other interesting chapters in that book. Two that I would just highlight are Peter Dorey's chapter, Theresa May's Mode of Conservatism, Soft One Nation Toryism, and Andrew Barclay's chapter, Theresa May and Religion, a Vicar's Daughter at number 10. But there are many others that may attract your attention. So if you're very rich or you have access to a library that has the book, then you may wish to take a look inside.
That's all for this week's Since Attlee and Churchill. As a reminder, if you enjoy listening to the podcast, we'd be thrilled if you left us a positive review wherever you get your podcasts from, and also that you can enjoy the podcast ad-free and also hear some bonus episodes by joining our Patreon. There's a link to that in the show notes. It's also just a great way to support the podcast and keep us going. We'll be back on Thursday with our next midweek Matters of Interest. We'll see you then.
Thanks very much.